What if the King of Britain had his most intimate conversations secretly recorded and exposed to the world? In 1989, Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles shared what they believed was a private phone call, only to have it intercepted by an unknown individual. Years later, in 1993, that recording surfaced, sending shockwaves through the monarchy and igniting one of the most humiliating scandals in royal history. How was this private call intercepted? Why did it take years for the tapes to be leaked? Let's dive into details. It was a late evening in December 1989, and Prince Charles was on the phone with Camilla Parker Bowles. Their conversation was casual at first, a familiar exchange between two people who had known each other for decades. But as the minutes passed, the tone shifted. Affection crept into their words, playful teasing turned intimate, and before long, the call became something neither of them would ever have imagined would be heard by the outside world. What they didn't know was that someone else was listening. A private citizen, using nothing more than a radio scanner, had intercepted the call. In the pre-digital age, when cordless phones relied on radio frequencies, certain conversations could be picked up by anyone with the right equipment. It wasn't something that happened often, and it certainly wasn't legal. But that night, in a coincidence that would go on to shake the British monarchy, one of the most private calls between the future king and the woman he loved was recorded. The tape didn't make headlines right away. In fact, after the recording was made, it remained hidden for years, known only to a select few. At the time, Charles and Camilla's relationship was the subject of quiet speculation, but nothing had ever been proven. The prince was still married to Princess Diana, and despite rumors of tension in their marriage, the royal family maintained a public front of unity. If the recording had surfaced then, it might have accelerated events, forcing the monarchy to confront the reality of Charles's personal life far earlier than they had planned. But for now, the tape was a secret, one that would eventually resurface at the worst possible moment. By the early 1990s, cracks in the marriage of Charles and Diana had become impossible to ignore. The press had already begun speculating about affairs, and Diana herself had made subtle comments hinting at her unhappiness. Then, in December 1992, the royal family made a public announcement. Prince Charles and Princess Diana were officially separating. The news was a shock, but not entirely unexpected. What came next, however, would push the monarchy into one of its most scandalous chapters. It was around this time that the Camillagate tape found its way to the press. Whether it was sold, leaked, or strategically released remains a matter of speculation. But in early 1993, an Australian magazine became the first publication to report on its existence. At first, the British press held back. There was no precedent for publishing such a deeply personal conversation, particularly one involving the heir to the throne. But then, the inevitable happened. The full transcript was printed. The words spoken in the privacy of that phone call were suddenly available for the entire world to read. The reaction was immediate and brutal. British tabloids pounced on the story, branding it Camillagate and ridiculing Charles over his intimate remarks. The most infamous line, the moment he jokingly expressed a desire to live inside Camilla's trousers and suggested he could be reincarnated as a tampon, became a source of relentless mockery. Late-night talk shows, comedians, and columnists seized the moment, turning a private exchange into a national joke. Beyond the humor, however, there was real damage. The tape confirmed what had long been rumored. Charles and Camilla's affair was not just speculation but fact. For the British public, still deeply attached to Princess Diana, the revelation painted a damning picture of their future king. Charles, once seen as a composed and dignified figure, was now viewed as a man who had humiliated his wife and embarrassed the monarchy. Camilla, previously a background figure in royal gossip, became one of the most criticized women in Britain. Buckingham Palace had little choice but to go into full damage control. Their response followed a familiar pattern. The royal family did not issue a public statement, did not confirm or deny the recording's authenticity, and did not engage in the scandal publicly. But behind closed doors, the impact was undeniable. The monarchy's carefully managed image had been shattered, and Charles's reputation was at its lowest point. The scandal also raised broader questions about privacy, media ethics, and the lengths to which journalists were willing to go for a story. While some defended the publication of the transcript as a matter of public interest, others questioned whether personal conversations, even those involving a future king, should ever be considered fair game. The recording had not been the result of investigative journalism, but of an illegal interception, a breach of privacy that, in another context, might have been condemned rather than celebrated. For Charles and Camilla, the aftermath was painful and prolonged. Camilla, already seen as the woman who had come between Charles and Diana, faced relentless public scrutiny. She withdrew even further from public life, avoiding attention as much as possible. Charles, meanwhile, spent years working to rehabilitate his image, a challenge that would take over a decade to overcome. In the long run, the scandal did not prevent Charles and Camilla from being together. Years later, after Diana's tragic death and a slow process of public acceptance, they would marry in 2005, solidifying Camilla's place in the royal family. But the damage done in 1993 left a lasting mark. Even today, references to Camillagate linger in discussions about the monarchy's history, a reminder of the moment when a private conversation became a public spectacle, changing the course of royal life forever. It had been weeks since the separation of Prince Charles and Princess Diana was announced to the public. The news was still fresh, and the royal family was already struggling to control the narrative. The public reaction had been overwhelming, with Diana receiving widespread sympathy, while Charles faced mounting criticism. The monarchy, already under pressure, had little idea that a far greater storm was about to break. In early 1993, whispers of a secret recording involving Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles began circulating in media circles. At first, it seemed like just another unfounded rumor, the kind that often swirled around the royal family. But this time, there was something different. Journalists who had seen or heard snippets of the recording knew that if the tape ever became public, it would be explosive. What they didn't know was who had it and when it would surface. That question was answered when an Australian magazine published a report claiming that a private phone call between Charles and Camilla had been intercepted and recorded years earlier. The revelation was shocking, but the worst was yet to come. Within days, the British press, despite initial hesitation, began covering the story. What followed was one of the most damaging leaks in modern royal history. The full transcript of the call soon made its way into the hands of tabloid journalists. As details emerged, the scandal gained momentum and public curiosity skyrocketed. The conversation was intimate, personal, and entirely inappropriate for public consumption. But the press did not hold back. They printed every word, ensuring that millions of readers across the United Kingdom and beyond would see the private exchange between Charles and Camilla. The most infamous moment in the conversation was a brief but unforgettable remark by Prince Charles, where he jokingly expressed a desire to live inside Camilla's trousers and, in a moment of awkward humor, suggested that he could be reincarnated as a tampon. The reaction was immediate. This single remark became the defining feature of the scandal, with newspapers splashing it across front pages and comedians seizing upon it for jokes that would persist for years. For the royal family, the fallout was catastrophic. Charles was already facing scrutiny over his failed marriage, and now, with undeniable proof of his affair in the hands of the press, his public image took an even greater hit. The monarchy had seen its fair share of scandals over the years, but this was different. This was not speculation or anonymous sources. This was the future King of Britain, caught in a deeply personal exchange that the world was never meant to hear. Camilla, who had largely remained out of the public eye, suddenly became one of the most talked-about figures in the country. While Charles had already been dealing with negative press over his marital issues, Camilla had managed to avoid the brunt of public scrutiny until now. The release of the transcript shattered that, turning her into a symbol of royal controversy. For the first time, she was widely named in newspapers and became a central figure in the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage. Buckingham Palace was unprepared for the sheer scale of the scandal. In previous years, the press had generally shown restraint when it came to matters of extreme privacy. There had been leaks before, but none as intrusive as this. The question was, how did it happen? How had a private call between Charles and Camilla, made years earlier, suddenly become headline news? The recording had been made by a private individual, a radio enthusiast who had stumbled upon the conversation using a scanning device. At the time, analog phone calls, especially from cordless landlines, could occasionally be picked up using radio frequency scanners. The individual who intercepted the call reportedly recorded it and kept it for years before eventually passing it along to someone willing to share it with the media. Though illegal, the tape had made its way into circulation. Some speculated that it had been deliberately leaked to damage Charles's reputation, while others believed it had simply been sitting in the wrong hands for too long. Regardless of how it surfaced, once it was out, there was no stopping the damage. Public reaction was overwhelmingly negative. Many were furious that such an invasion of privacy had been allowed to happen, but just as many, if not more, saw it as evidence of Charles's betrayal of Diana. The press had already been siding with the Princess of Wales, portraying her as the wronged party in a marriage that had never truly been happy. Now, with undeniable proof of Charles's affair, the balance of public sympathy tipped even further in Diana's favor. Political figures also weighed in, with some questioning whether Charles, as the future king, had compromised the dignity of the monarchy. Traditionalists within royal circles feared that the scandal would do irreparable harm to the institution. Though Charles was still seen as the rightful heir, this incident made some question whether he was fit to lead. For Diana, the scandal was both vindicating and painful. She had long known about Charles and Camilla's relationship, but now the entire world had proof. While she did not comment publicly on the recording, many believed that its release only strengthened her position in the ongoing separation. In the eyes of the public, she was not just a princess in a troubled marriage, she was a woman who had been deeply wronged by the man destined to be king. Camilla, unlike Charles, did not have the power of the palace behind her. She had no royal title to shield her from public criticism, no official role to justify her presence in the headlines. For months, she endured relentless tabloid scrutiny. Though she remained silent, her life changed overnight. Friends and family were questioned, journalists camped outside her home, and every move she made was analyzed through the lens of the scandal. The story refused to fade. Even as the royal family worked behind the scenes to contain the damage, the British public was not ready to move on. The scandal dominated news cycles for weeks, and even after it started to subside, it left behind lasting damage. For Charles, regaining public trust would take years. His popularity, once steady, took a severe hit, and many believed he would never recover from the embarrassment. For Camilla, the path to acceptance seemed impossible. But in the short term, the most pressing issue was survival, how to move forward when the entire country was watching. The British monarchy had endured scandals before, but nothing like this. The Camilla Gate tape had not only confirmed suspicions about Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles, but had also exposed their private moments in a way that no royal had ever experienced. Unlike past controversies, which were often built on speculation and carefully worded statements from anonymous sources, this was undeniable. It was Charles and Camilla's own voices, their own words, played back to a public eager for every detail. The damage to Charles's reputation was immediate and severe. Already facing criticism over his failed marriage to Diana, he was now at the center of a media firestorm that mocked his most intimate remarks. Late-night talk shows and newspaper cartoons made a spectacle of his conversation, his comment about wanting to be reincarnated as a tampon. The monarchy, traditionally shielded by its distance from public scrutiny, was now dealing with something it could not control. For Camilla, the impact was even more personal. Unlike Charles, she was not a public figure with official palace support. She had never sought media attention and had largely remained out of the spotlight. But now, her name was everywhere. She was vilified by the press, portrayed as the woman who had come between Charles and Diana. The public, deeply sympathetic to Diana, saw her as the reason for the breakdown of the royal marriage. In reality, Charles and Diana's issues had begun long before Camilla re-entered the picture. But perception was more powerful than truth. The intense media scrutiny made daily life nearly impossible for Camilla. Paparazzi followed her every move, and journalists camped outside her home, hoping to catch even the slightest reaction. Friends and family were questioned, with reporters digging for any new details about her past or her ongoing relationship with Charles. She did not speak publicly, nor did she attempt to defend herself. Instead, she retreated from view, staying out of the public eye as much as possible. The royal family, known for its ability to remain silent through even the most intense media storms, had no clear strategy for handling this situation. In the past, their approach had always been to wait for public attention to shift, knowing that the press would eventually move on to another story. But this time, the scandal had staying power. The recording had been made years earlier, yet it felt immediate and raw, as if Charles and Camilla had just been caught in the act. The monarchy's silence only fueled the speculation, leading to further questions about how long the affair had been going on and whether Diana had been misled from the start. For Diana, the scandal added a new dimension to her already complicated public image. While she did not comment on the recording, she did not need to. Public opinion was firmly on her side. The tape was seen as proof that she had been right all along, that her marriage had been undermined not by her failings, but by a love that had existed long before she ever entered the picture. The narrative of Diana as the wronged wife, trapped in an unhappy marriage, became even more entrenched in the public's mind. Meanwhile, Charles faced a battle not just to restore his reputation, but to secure his future as king. His advisors worried that the scandal had done irreparable harm to his image. The monarchy relied on public support, and while its structure was not democratic, the British people had a powerful say in how they viewed their future king. Some commentators speculated that the scandal might weaken his claim to the throne, raising the question of whether the crown should pass directly to Prince William when the time came. As weeks turned into months, the press continued to analyze every angle of the story. The origins of the recording remained a subject of speculation. The fact that a private phone call between two individuals had been intercepted, recorded, and then leaked raised serious concerns about privacy and media ethics. Some argued that the leak was a violation of personal boundaries, that even public figures had a right to private conversations. Others saw it differently, arguing that Charles, as the heir to the throne, had a duty to uphold the dignity of the monarchy, and that the recording had revealed a side of him that was unbefitting of a future king. The controversy also reignited debates about the role of the press in covering the royal family. In the past, there had been an unspoken agreement between the media and the palace. Certain aspects of royal life were considered off-limits. But by the early 1990s, that line had been erased. The press had become more aggressive, willing to push boundaries that had once been respected. The Camillagate scandal was proof of this shift. The publication of the transcript, followed by relentless coverage, signaled that nothing was truly private anymore. Behind the scenes, Charles and Camilla continued to see each other, though far more discreetly. They had already spent years navigating the complexities of their relationship, knowing that public acceptance would be difficult. Now, that challenge seemed even greater. Camilla's position was especially precarious. She was not a royal, nor did she have any official standing. Her connection to Charles was based solely on their personal history, and the scandal had made it clear that many in Britain did not approve of that history. The long-term effects of the scandal were not immediately clear. In the short term, it had caused significant embarrassment and had intensified the scrutiny on Charles's personal life. But the royal family, despite its many challenges, had survived worse. The question was whether Charles and Camilla could recover from this moment, whether their relationship could withstand the weight of public disapproval. By the middle of 1993, the media's attention began to shift. Other news stories took precedence, and while the scandal did not fade completely, it no longer dominated headlines as it once had. For Charles and Camilla, however, the consequences remained. Camilla continued to live largely outside the public eye, avoiding the limelight as much as possible. Charles, meanwhile, focused on his royal duties, attempting to move forward despite the lingering damage. The scandal had proven that even the most private moments could become public in an instant. It was a lesson that the royal family would not forget. The British monarchy had always operated on the idea that it was separate from ordinary life, that it functioned according to its own rules and traditions. But in the modern world, where technology and media scrutiny were advancing at an unprecedented rate, that separation was becoming harder to maintain. Years later, as Charles and Camilla gradually re-emerged into public life together, the effects of the scandal still lingered. It would take more than a decade for their relationship to be accepted, and even then, the past was never truly forgotten. The Camillagate scandal had been a turning point, not just for them, but for the monarchy itself. It had shown that privacy was no longer guaranteed, that even the highest figures in the land were vulnerable to exposure. It had been a painful lesson, but one that shaped the way the royal family managed its image in the years to come. The British monarchy had endured scandals before, but the Camillagate tapes were unlike anything that had come before. For the first time, the world had undeniable proof of Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles' relationship, laid bare in their own words. The embarrassment was not just personal but institutional, striking at the very image of the royal family. For a monarchy built on discretion, duty, and dignity, this scandal was a direct assault on everything it sought to uphold. As the months passed, the impact of the tapes continued to shape public perception. Prince Charles, once regarded as a composed future king, was now the subject of widespread ridicule. The British press, always eager for royal controversy, had made him the target of endless satire. His words from the tape, particularly the infamous remark about being reincarnated as a tampon, were printed and reprinted, exaggerated and mocked. Cartoons depicted him as a figure of humiliation, and late-night talk shows in both Britain and the United States used the scandal as regular material for comedy. For Camilla, the consequences were even more severe. Unlike Charles, she had no official palace support, no royal role to justify her presence in the public eye. She had been a private citizen before the tapes surfaced, but now, she was one of the most talked-about women in the country. Paparazzi followed her relentlessly, and newspapers dissected every aspect of her past, from her marriage to Andrew Parker Bowles to her long-standing connection with Charles. The media was unforgiving, portraying her as the woman who had not only stolen the prince's heart, but had helped destroy his marriage to Diana. Inside Buckingham Palace, there was no official response. The royal family had long operated under the principle of never commenting on scandals, believing that silence was the best way to avoid fueling public outrage. But behind closed doors, there was deep concern. The monarchy had survived past controversies, but this was different. The revelation of Charles and Camilla's private conversation had made the future king look foolish, weakening his image at a time when the public was already divided over his suitability to reign. Advisors worried about the long-term consequences. Would the public ever fully accept Charles as king after this? Could Camilla's reputation recover enough for their relationship to be recognized in any official capacity? Meanwhile, Diana continued to command overwhelming public support. The Camillagate scandal had effectively confirmed what many had suspected. She had been trapped in a marriage where love had long since faded, and she had been the one who had suffered most. The media framed her as the innocent party, the princess wronged by a husband who had never truly been hers. She did not need to make public statements. The public had already chosen sides. The monarchy had been forced into an uncomfortable position, knowing that any attempt to defend Charles would only backfire. The scandal also had political ramifications. The British government traditionally remained neutral on royal matters, but some politicians questioned whether Charles, in the wake of such embarrassment, should reconsider his position in the line of succession. There was no constitutional mechanism to remove him, and Queen Elizabeth remained firmly supportive of her son, but discussions about the long-term future of the monarchy began to surface. Some suggested that perhaps Charles should step aside when the time came, allowing Prince William to take the throne instead. These conversations did not gain serious traction at the time, but they planted the seeds of a debate that would continue for years. Beyond Britain, the scandal had global implications. The royal family's image had always been one of its greatest strengths, allowing it to maintain relevance in a world where monarchies were becoming increasingly obsolete. But now, that image has been damaged. International press outlets covered the scandal extensively, and in Commonwealth nations where support for the monarchy was already waning, the controversy only added to calls for greater independence. As public interest in the scandal continued, investigative journalists began looking deeper into how the recording had surfaced in the first place. The revelation that the call had been intercepted by a private citizen using a radio scanner raised serious concerns about privacy. If a conversation between the future king and his companion could be so easily accessed, what did that say about security? Had the palace been unaware of this vulnerability, or had they underestimated the risks of modern technology? For Charles and Camilla, life after the scandal was marked by caution. They continued to see each other but took extreme measures to avoid further public scrutiny. Camilla, already reluctant to be in the public eye, withdrew even more, avoiding major social events and staying within the small circle of friends who had supported her through the fallout. Charles, meanwhile, focused on his royal duties, attempting to rebuild his reputation through charitable work and public engagements. Despite the scandal, the relationship between Charles and Camilla did not end. If anything, the events of Camillagate had strengthened their bond, proving that their connection could endure even under the harshest public scrutiny. But the road to public acceptance would be long. For years after the scandal, any mention of Camilla in the press was met with hostility. The idea that she could one day be recognized as Charles's official partner, let alone his wife, seemed unthinkable. By the mid-1990s, as the monarchy navigated further challenges, including the finalization of Charles and Diana's divorce, the scandal gradually faded from headlines. But its impact remained. It had reshaped the way the public viewed the royal family, particularly the idea of a future King Charles. It had intensified the growing rift between the palace and the press, setting the stage for even more contentious battles over privacy in the years to come. And it had left an enduring mark on Charles and Camilla, forcing them to spend years rebuilding their image in the eyes of a public that had not been ready to accept their relationship. As history would later show, Camillagate was not the end of their story. But in those first few years after the scandal broke, it seemed like an obstacle that neither of them would ever be able to overcome. The damage had been done, and whether or not the public could ever forget was a question that remained unanswered. The fallout from the Camillagate scandal had settled into a new reality for the British royal family. While the media had moved on to fresh headlines, the damage done to Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles had not been forgotten. The monarchy, an institution built on tradition and carefully maintained public perception, had suffered one of its most embarrassing breaches of privacy. The tapes had exposed not only the reality of Charles's extramarital relationship, but also the vulnerability of the royal family in an era of increasing media intrusion. While Charles faced professional repercussions, Camilla bore the brunt of the public's ire. She had never been a public figure in the way Diana had, nor had she sought attention. But the media had turned her into a central character in the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage. She was blamed, criticized, and vilified in ways that far exceeded anything Charles experienced. Her name became synonymous with scandal, and even those within her social circles found it difficult to associate with her without attracting negative attention. Diana, on the other hand, emerged from the scandal more beloved than ever. The tapes had confirmed what she had long hinted at in public. Her marriage had been broken for years, and she had been left to navigate it largely on her own. The Camillagate scandal made her appear even more sympathetic in the eyes of the public, reinforcing the idea that she had been wronged by a system that prioritized duty over personal happiness. While Charles struggled to regain respect, Diana's popularity only grew, solidifying her status as the people's princess. The impact of the scandal was not limited to public perception. Within the palace, there was a growing realization that the old ways of handling media scrutiny were no longer effective. The monarchy had always relied on a controlled relationship with the press, offering limited access in exchange for a degree of respect for privacy. But the emergence of more aggressive tabloid culture had changed that dynamic. The press no longer played by the old rules, and the royal family found itself struggling to navigate a world where privacy could be invaded at any moment. Camillagate also raised broader concerns about the security of royal communications. The fact that a private phone call between Charles and Camilla had been intercepted so easily was alarming. At the time of the call, the idea that analog telephone conversations could be picked up by scanning devices was not widely known. But once it became clear that this was how the call had been recorded, questions were raised about the vulnerability of other royal communications. Had more private conversations been intercepted without the public's knowledge? Were there other recordings that had not yet surfaced? The scandal forced the royal family to reconsider how they handled their most personal communications, leading to stricter security measures in the years that followed. As the mid-1990s progressed, the royal family faced even greater challenges. The separation of Charles and Diana turned into a formal divorce in 1996, marking the official end of their marriage. By this point, the damage from Camillagate had begun to fade into the background, but its consequences were still felt. The divorce, though inevitable, had been made all the more painful by the public nature of their split, exacerbated by the revelations from the tapes. For Charles and Camilla, the path forward remained uncertain. While they continued their relationship in private, there was no clear indication of what the future would hold. The idea of Camilla ever becoming an accepted part of the royal family seemed unthinkable. The British public had not forgiven her, and there was little reason to believe that would change. Then, in 1997, tragedy struck. Princess Diana's death in a car crash in Paris shocked the world and sent the royal family into a period of profound crisis. The public outpouring of grief was immense, and in the days following her death, the monarchy faced one of its most difficult moments. The Queen's initial silence, in keeping with royal tradition, was met with anger from a grieving nation. For Charles, the tragedy was deeply personal, but it also reignited public scrutiny over his past. The memory of Camillagate resurfaced, as many saw Diana's fate as the final chapter in a story that had been set in motion years earlier. In the wake of Diana's passing, Charles and Camilla's relationship became even more complicated. While they remained together, there was no immediate effort to introduce Camilla as an official partner. The royal family knew that any public acknowledgement of their relationship so soon after Diana's death would be disastrous. For years, Charles and Camilla kept a low profile, rarely appearing in public together. The efforts to repair Charles's image became even more critical, as the future of the monarchy depended on regaining public trust. With that, we have reached the end of today's video. If you have come this far with us, be sure to check out other videos on the channel.